Shocking news coming out of Ethiopia this weekend. Scores of protesters reported killed at a religious festival in the Oromia region. Here to help us make sense of it, we have Ethiopian journalist Zecharias Zelalem, who joins us on the line from Montreal. Zecharias, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Could you give us, for the benefit of those of us who haven't been following perhaps the political situation in Ethiopia particularly closely, could you give us the background to this weekend's events?
Okay, so the Irreecha festival, which is a religious cultural festival, an annual gathering that attracts millions of people across the country every year to the city of Bishoftu, was different in its circumstances this year, as it was done with the very high public sentiment of anti-government feeling, or so to do with the Oromo protests, the 11-month Oromo protests going on, and there was already a fear that something would transpire, something would, well, not as bad as the tragedy that we saw yesterday, but something would occur that would result in a certain number of casualties occurring. And with this in mind, people, as of the first day of the gathering, as of the first day of the Irreecha festival, were making the same calls, echoing the same calls that they were echoing for 11 months now.
So can we take, Zecharias, can we just take it back a step? What has been the crux of these 11-month Oromo protests?
What has been the what? Sorry?
What has been the central issue behind these protests spanning almost a year?
The central issue now, well, the whole thing had erupted over the land grabs that the government the land grab plan that the government had implemented 11 months ago. But right now, it is really just a general outrage over the killings of protesters. Something like 500 protesters since November of last year. It is really more than just a political issue now. It is really just a general rage over mass killings, state-sponsored killings. And as we saw, the trend continued yesterday on a scale that none of us could have ever imagined.
So you mentioned the scale, and I've seen wildly conflicting reports on the number of protesters actually killed yesterday. Anything from numbers in the low teens to over 100. Do we have a clear indication of how many died?
Yes, as you see, as of yesterday, even hours before the massacre actually took place, there was an institutional effort to make sure information would, the flow of information would be halted. Telephone lines and internet services were cut off to the area. That is what's made the confirmation of the statistics very difficult. But from what I can tell you, today the opposition Oromo Federal Congress Party, the OFC, they spoke of having confirmed of 678 deaths. 678 deaths in yesterday's massacre. This was after a full 24 hours of fact-checking and communicating with the hospital officials and everything. And from all the eyewitnesses I've spoke to, the minimum, the least, the smallest number that they've been given is, everything is starting from at least 120 and above.
Now,
so
Zecharias,
an idea.
You're calling it a massacre. I've seen other media outlets refer to it simply as a stampede. It's a gruesome question, I know, but do we know anything about the mechanics of how these people actually met their deaths?
Yes, well, as I mentioned earlier, there were millions of people who had converged upon Bishoftu. So we have more than enough people to testify first-hand eyewitness accounts of what actually happened. So the official version, the government-given version of the whole thing being a result of a stampede, you have to say it's very far-fetched in nature when you decide to make the effort and actually communicate with people who were there, because everybody who was there has a very similar story of gunshots being fired from the air and on the ground by forces loyal to the regime. And if you look at, if you decide to do your own research via social media, there's video footage available of the carnage in which you can really hear the very audible sounds of automatic gunfire And to declare this whole thing a massacre from a simple tragic accident like a stampede, it's really just it's an insult to all those who died and to all their relatives who are now, in the agony of mourning a tragedy.
Now, I assume that the Oromo people must be in shock, obviously, as you say, also in a state, I'm sure, of anger. Where does this leave us? Can we expect to see an upsurge in protest action, or are people scared?
Well, what people need to realize is this didn't start tragically. This hasn't started yesterday. It's been going on for about 11 months now. Thankfully, not at such a level, but it's been a while, and the people are at the point of no return. We cannot expect people to simply return to going back to work and just carrying on with their everyday duties, because the trauma that has been inflicted upon the population is just immense. That right now, even negotiations are almost almost an impossible scenario. I mean, how could you negotiate with a government that doesn't even recognize the fact that it has killed this many people? I think the protests are going to intensify, and it's very, very sad to say, but I think we're yet to see the end of the fatalities. We probably will see much more with this current trend continuing. The only way things can somehow turn out better would be, principally, the government needs to withdraw its forces from all the urban and rural population centers. But as the government doesn't believe it's doing anything wrong, it calls it an anti-terrorist. It calls its operations an anti-terrorist operation. I think we're headed for more bloodshed. It's very sad to say.
Zecharias, you say that you talk, for instance, there of negotiations with government. Who is doing the negotiating on behalf of the Oromo protesters? Is there an elected body?
No, there isn't an elected body, because all the legitimate representatives of the Oromo peoples, of the Amhara peoples, of the Konso peoples, of everybody negotiating, have been detained or killed over the past 10, 11 months. Negotiations were simply in the scenario that somebody with some mustard grain of common sense would say, hey, we need to stop because this isn't heading anywhere. Let's try change of tactics. Let's try addressing the concerns of the people. Let's sit down around the table and see what we can do. Because other than that, it's just going to be one killing after another massacre after another. And there is no negotiations right now as of yesterday, as of now, for the past 11 months. There has been no sincere attempt whatsoever to communicate with the protests and the protest movements.
Ethiopia's leadership has repeatedly painted a picture of Ethiopia as a beacon of stability in a troubled region, and it's a story that seems to have gained an amazing amount of traction overseas, particularly with the international media. How have they been so successful in quashing news of dissent, the dissent that is actually happening on the ground?
Well, their success in quashing the flow of information and the dissent on the ground we have to admit that the Ethiopian government, when it comes to diplomacy, it's really set the standard. It has partners from every region of the world, and it has cooperation with everybody from the left wing to the right wing, to people on both sides of the traditional Cold War barrier. This is why you're not going to see the traditional condemnation that countries like Zimbabwe, for example, are used to on a daily basis, because a lot of these superpowers with a say in the world, like the United States and Russia and China, a lot of them are shareholders in different projects in deals in Ethiopia with the Ethiopian government, and they would have a lot to lose if they decided to just terminate their friendship for the sake of human rights and human lives. This is why Ethiopia sort of has a stronghold on the condemnation that it would normally get. The American government in recent months has always just released their statements. It's really a half-hearted, you can call them a half-hearted condemnation, where it declares that it is deeply concerned with developments for the region, but you never hear them outright declare that they are outraged and angered at what is an outright massacre of human beings. And so, like I said, this is thanks to the Ethiopia's diplomacy, international diplomacy, that you can say that they have so far remained unscathed on the global stage.
It's shocking stuff. Do you think that yesterday's events are likely to put a dent in its international image? Could this be the beginning of a tipping point in terms of the truth coming out, so to speak?
Well, in order for there to be any sort of a serious dent in the image of Ethiopia as like you said, as a beacon of peace and stability in the region, for one thing, we would need the cooperation of international media outlets who are covering the story. And I think I can speak on behalf of the majority of Ethiopians when I say I'm very disappointed in the coverage, for example, that the Irreecha massacre yesterday has given. Because if you look at the likes of, I'm not going to have to mention names, but all the major major international media outlets, they have all just decided to carry the official version. They have made no real effort to investigate into what actually happened. And as of today, the major reports are that a stampede, a tragic accident occurred after a clash. The way they describe it, it sounds like it was a schoolyard brawl.
Yeah.
So the people are very disappointed. If you actually take the time to seek out people who were there, they will tell you about how they feel let down, disappointed in how international media have been covering it. We feel alone. We feel abandoned by the world, and it's the global coverage that has contributed to us being left behind and our voice muzzled.
Where could we go for reliable coverage on the actual events taking place in Ethiopia at the moment, bearing in mind that most of us do not speak an indigenous Ethiopian language?
Yes, I understand there's a lot of difficulties when it comes to getting credible information out of the country. And tragically, as you see, journalists who are covering the story like myself, we have to do it from abroad or from exile, because a lot of our colleagues and a lot of our friends in the domain are behind bars or are facing threats. Threats of incarceration, torture, among other things. So right now, the recommendable course of action would be to look at our many partners in the social media world, both at home and abroad, who on a daily basis, especially those living in the country, risking their lives to get information out and to get the images and videos that we've been able to see since yesterday. Those are right now, those people are the Ethiopian people's gateway to the world right now. Because, like I said, we've been let down by the international community. It's been a massive disappointment.
Zecharias Zelalem, thank you so much for joining us from Montreal. Zecharias, an Ethiopian journalist, giving some shocking insight into yesterday's events in the Oromia region, which has largely been reported on among mainstream international media as a stampede, which has caused the deaths of between, in the region of 50 people. Zecharias, who says he has sources on the ground, saying that in actual fact the number of people killed in yesterday's protests in Ethiopia more to the tune of 678, and that it's completely inaccurate to say that they died in a stampede, but rather that in footage available of what happened yesterday, you can clearly hear the sound of gunfire.